Hi, Misha here, and a few things came to my mind. And this video was something very impromptu that I just kind of got into. People have asked a few more milsurp videos, which I'm happy to oblige. We have been doing quite a few modern things lately, and it's nice to slow things down before we get into the spring season and summer. So I thought a good topic would be looking at an interesting, although relatively brief, generation in military firearms. You know, for centuries, military firearms were single shot. And then, for roughly 1 century, bolt actions were the thing. Sometimes lever actions. Repeaters of some type. And today, since really the 1950s, 60s, battle rifles, assault rifles, essentially select fire guns have been the name of the game. But in between bolt actions and the modern select fire guns were an interesting group of self-loading military rifles, semi-auto onlys. And while these saw widespread use, they weren't really developed in a lot of countries. Technology kind of progressed on past them quite rapidly, but they were very iconic because of their timing and usage in World War II. In fact, these are mostly developed because of World War I, the outgrowth of that war. So, World War II, they saw a lot of combat. And I have most of them here from that generation, which really began in the mid to late 30s. And all of these guns were at least developed and on offer by the mid to late 40s. So we're really only looking at about a decade for them being developed, and then in service for another one and a half decades. Most all of these models would have been out by the 50s, 60s. Some would hold on in some roles through the 70s. So we're going to talk about each one in some detail, and then I'm going to compare and contrast and kind of rank them on several terms, but we'll get to that in a little while. But as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, check out the link over to Patreon. Before we get into the list, a couple of honorable mentions that don't quite qualify as much as I wish they would and really like the guns. The Soviet-Russian SKS and the American, developed by Winchester, U.S. carbine M1. The M1 carbine is definitively a World War II gun, absolutely. But it was designed as something else, a pistol replacement. It fires quite a weak, by rifle standards, 7.62 by 33 cartridge. Often in gun shops and ammo dealers, this is classed as a pistol cartridge. It's kind of right on that line. And they were employed as rifles or carbines, but it's not even really an intermediate cartridge. It's a heavy pistol cartridge, maybe a light rifle. Also, this gun was originally set out to be select fire. Again, more like a submachine gun. Now, in the event, the first ones were semi-auto only, just so they could get them into the field. But then conversion kits would get issued later in the war, and then of course the M2 would come along. So this is really not what we're talking about today. We're talking about full-size, full-power rifles of a certain generation and type. And the SKS is closer. Developed by Simonov after years of refining his basic system. This did see use in 1944 and 45, at least early versions. This is semi-auto only, feeding from a 10-round fixed mag, but again, it's firing the 7.62 by 39 intermediate cartridge, not a full-power rifle. And of course, this gun is more iconic for its Cold War annex than World War II. That said, when we do get to Russian guns, keep in mind this Simonov system with the tilting bolt and short stroke gas piston. Yeah. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that I'm not forgetting about these. They just don't quite fit what we're doing today, because we're going for the big boys, and we're going for that post-World War I generation that was developed in the interwar period based on Great War experiences, and that frankly was kind of a one and done. The same guns that were the first of a generation were the last of a generation because of technological developments we'll talk about towards the end of this video. So, with that, let's dive in. The U.S. rifle M1, commonly known and nicknamed the Garand for its inventor, John C. Garand. Of course, we had to start here. So, basic specs. 9.5 pounds, give or take. 43.5 inches long. 24-inch barrel. Fires 30-06 Springfield. 7.62 by 63 if you're being metric European. Uses a rotating bolt with 2 locking lugs and a long stroke tappet style gas piston operating system. Internal 8-round fixed magazine fed by en bloc clips. That's the Garand. And officially, this was the first mass-produced military rifle capable of self-loading semi-auto that was designed, intended, and was issued on a large general scale. Not specifics, not planned, but didn't take off. This was the first that was, in a way, successful. But of course, nothing, especially a first generation, is all roses. But, how did the Garand do? And why did this gun come to be? In World War I, the Great War, the bolt action ruled the day. That was pretty much what was there. And of course, America was no exception. It had the 1903 Springfield as the standard, and the 1917 so-called U.S. Enfield as the backup, both firing 30-06. One thing that happened with the 1903, though, they went to the universal short rifle concept. Relatively new one at the time. And it would have roughly a 24-inch barrel, something that would be carried over to the Garand. Similarly, this semi-pistol grip stock, the A1 style stock, would be carried over to the Garand, so you see a certain amount of uniformity. But I brought this particular Springfield out to show you what makes it a little different, and to show America's earliest efforts at a self-loading infantry rifle. For you see, this is not an ordinary 1903. This is a 1903 Mark I. You can tell because of the cutout in the receiver wall. That was for ejecting cases from the Patterson device. Something that was very important and given a very high priority, and also considered to be very hush-hush, very top secret in World War I. This was to be our trench warfare winning secret. And so you would pull the bolt out and put in this device, and it would turn your bolt action 5-shot into magically a semi-auto 30-shot. The downside, you were firing pretty small cartridges. In fact, they were weaker than even the 30 U.S. carbine we just looked at. So you could rapid fire, but there were issues. And that meant a soldier had to carry different ammo, a whole different device on his belt, and of course there were issues besides. Still, this illustrates early on the desire for every infantryman and every rifleman to be a little machine gunner, or at least a little rapid fire. And of course that wouldn't be the only effort America had in World War I, but it is the beginning. I should also mention that it wasn't just this cutout. Parts of the trigger group and ejector and everything had to be different on the Mark I as well. But that project really didn't go much of anywhere. Kind of a shame, but probably for the best. at the very end, they also had the 1918 BAR, chambered in 30-06. It was an interesting thing. We think of the BAR as a light machine gun today, but the initial concept was more of an assault rifle. Unfortunately, it was an assault rifle made with the technology of 1918. So it fired the full power cartridge, 20-round mags. Anyone who's picked up a BAR, it's heavy. Exceedingly heavy. And that influenced the Garand. Right after the war, the U.S. Army, mainly, said the next generation should be a self-loading rifle. There had been some experimenting, even some limited use by other nations with such guns in the war, so the idea was there. By 1921, they kind of laid out specifications. No more than 9 pounds. So they were learning from the BAR already. It needed to be short enough, light enough, handy enough to shoulder. It didn't need a tripod or bipod. It needed to be one-man portable. It needed to be able to be topped off with stripper clips or some other type of clip mechanism. It needed to be able to be mass-produced effectively. It needed to be essentially able for any soldier to pick up and use. And that was the initial kind of specs. And the 1920s were experimentation. It's also when John Garand first went to work for Springfield. And there would be 2 quick competitions. First, should the new self-loading rifle be chambered for 30-06, the traditional, or a new cartridge, which would end up being 276 Pedersen. Essentially, almost an intermediate cartridge, small diameter by that standard. Good idea. And at first, this won out. So, the next thing was the rifle. The 2 top contenders were from Garand, and the other from Thompson of submachine gun fame. And these would both have prototypes chambered for the 276 round, and they would start competing around 1930, 1931. And there had been earlier competitions, but this is when something like this was starting to take form. And actually, the Garand in 276 won out, but in 32-33, Douglas MacArthur said, nope, we're not going to a new cartridge. We have way too many rounds of 30-06 in storage. Not going to happen. Not going to do it. Keep in mind, the Army, the Navy, everyone was on a shoestring budget at this time, and we're at the depths of the Depression. So you kind of get where they were coming from. So the guns were reworked for 30-06, and at that time, the T1E2 became the M1 Garand, and around 75 were produced in 1934 for field testing, field trials. And problems were found, addressed, and in 1936 the pattern was standardized and essentially officially adopted. 1937 would be the first production batch, and these would go to trial units again, and more problems would be found. Throughout 1937, all the way through 1940, even into 41, there was a bunch of back and forth. People act like today the M1 Garand came out fully formed. Oh, far from it. While many aspects were changed, tried, dropped, renewed, and improved, 2 areas that are of note: the magazine. The Army really wanted this flush magazine, and is the main reason we ended up with this unique en-bloc system. The benefits, of course, are that you don't have to worry about losing a magazine, producing extra mags. The BAR mags kind of gave some people a sour taste. They weren't the best design. They weren't the thing. As heavy duty as the BAR was, the magazines were kind of flimsy, at least by comparison. In addition, they would hang down quite a ways, and at the time, military doctrine often liked to go prone or otherwise go low profile. So this was kind of a compromised system. It was also felt that this would limit the soldiers' rate of fire, only having 8 at a time, because one of the major worries in America with a lot of the old-timers, the young kids would waste ammo. Again, shoestring budget. So that's where the en bloc system came from. Myths opinion abide. But the real change would come with the gas system. This is the system we know and love. there's a hole in the barrel that delivers gas, which impacts a piston, leads to an op rod, which connects directly to the bolt itself. Interesting that it is asymmetric on the right side and kind of bent. But it worked. It cycled the action, especially if you use the correct ammo. Using this gun, because it's not really an adjustable gas system, it is tuned exactly for M2 ball, which is why if you run other stuff in a Garand, you could very easily damage the op rod. But this isn't the original gas system. No. The original system, first installed in the design around 1929-1930, was the bang system. Back then, a lot of militaries, even a lot of designers, were worried about drilling holes in the barrel for various reasons. So the idea was to capture gas as it was coming out the muzzle and use that gas to push somehow the bolt back, cycle the action. Now this isn't anything new. In fact, certain systems similar to this go all the way back to the 19th century, but the bang system came out of Europe and was used in a few designs over the years, including the initial M1 Garand, not just the prototypes, but even the first several years of production up through 1939-1940. Unfortunately, the bang system had a lot of problems, and we'll talk more about those later in the video, mostly fouling and needing rapid and immediate cleaning, and just generally speaking being very finicky and heavy. Eventually they decided, hey, drilling a hole in the barrel, it will take their chance because the gas piston system runs cleaner, is more reliable, and even though it needs the M2 ball ammo, it's still less finicky. But with the first generation, the first few years of production, when Springfield was making these, well, they were bang guns. Now, fun fact, before the bang system, Garand did experiment with a gas piston around 1925-1926. So that I point that out. So it was kind of returning to something he looked at earlier. You know, figuring out what worked. So by 1939, the new gas piston system was being integrated. In 1940, it was being installed in new guns, and then they would go back to the older guns and retrofit them. Today, an M1 Garand with the original gas trap is exceedingly rare and exceedingly valuable. And when I say exceedingly valuable, I mean worth what a nice pickup truck brand new is, or maybe even a mobile home. Tens of thousands of dollars. So yeah, not really available. But this one sure is, and like I said at the beginning, is probably the most successful of this generation. Production started off slow as they ironed out the designs at Springfield, but by 1939-1940, Winchester would become the first contractor to build these, and by 1941, especially after Pearl Harbor, these were given priority at both factories, and production was quickly ramped up. And the Army would first get re-equipped, and then the Marines and others would get these, and they would replace older bolt guns. So in the beginning of the war, they were somewhat scarce, especially in the Pacific. But by the time this rifle was made, around 1945, they had pretty much fully replaced bolt actions except for a few special purposes. And production would continue at those two factories through the end of World War II. The Winchester production line would actually be sold off, finding its way to Italy. Springfield would start back up in 1950 for the Korean War. Now, they had built about 4 million during World War II. However, many were lost to attrition, and many were given away to allies, France, Italy, Denmark, whoever. So when America found itself fighting another major war so quickly, they needed more. This would lead in 1953 to International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson producing Garands, and they would build about 1.5 million more, along with Springfield, during the Korean War. And that the total would go over 6 million, including production in places like Italy and a few other things. In fact, Springfield would do one final run in 1957, using up extant parts that they had. By that time, it was being replaced by the M14, but it wouldn't actually be retired out of frontline service until around 1960. It would be very common in second-line service through 1963, and it would still be in the reserves through 1966 and ceremonial duty for long after that. In addition, many U.S. allies would continue to issue the Garand frontline throughout the 60s, even into the 70s, and of course you have developments like Beretta's BM-59. So that's the Garand in a nutshell. The positives, well, it is reliable for its generation, quite accurate, especially with nicely adjustable sights. This one still has the lock bar sights on it. Of course, well made even during the war. Reasonably short, 9.5 pounds. We're not too heavy. Downsides, it was a little fidgety to disassemble, swelling of wood stocks. The op rod could bend. That was kind of one of the weak points. And while the magazine wasn't a weak point in and of itself, some folks find loading it a bit tricky, hence the common term of Garand thumb. So, gotta acknowledge that. So, America was first, but only from a certain point of view. The French Fusil Automatique Modèle 1944, commonly known as, nicknamed the MAS 44. This has a 22.8-inch barrel and an overall length of just over 43 inches and a weight of roughly 10 pounds. But internally, it's quite interesting. We have a tilting or tipping bolt system, and it uses true direct impingement. It also feeds from detaching 10-round box magazines, and it fires 7.5 by 54, 7.5 French. So, now with that out of the way, this probably seems like a cheat or out of place. Everything about this rifle, its place in history, is pretty misleading. On the one hand, France lagged behind the US, Russia, and others in adopting a self-loading rifle or even an automatic rifle later on. But on the other hand, they started it all, and they were the first to actually put it into production. And while these really saw service after the war, this particular version was ordered during World War II and produced with the 1945 barrel date, so it counts. What am I talking about? Let's move the MAS 44 down so we can talk about this. The French Modèle, Fusil Automatique Modèle 1917, commonly nicknamed the RSC based on its three primary designers' names. Now, this is a World War I gun, but it does kind of give France the distinction of having mass-produced the first self-loading infantry rifle meant for just everyone. You can argue Russia, and we will, but there's a few caveats to that. This is one of the longest guns I own, because in a lot of ways it's based on the 1886 Lebel, and for that matter, Berthier, at least in principle, because they both fire the 8x50 rimmed round. Long barrel. And there was this push to go to self-loading guns, but to use the existing bolt-action systems, for example, the Enfield, or in America, the 1903, the Pedersen device with the Mark I. And that's how this kind of got put into production at MAT during World War I, because it did use a modified barrel from the others. It used modified furniture from the Lebel, and you would think it would use the same clips as a Berthier, but it doesn't. Not to get too far back, let me kind of rewind even further, because France started this. They achieved early success with the 8mm smokeless round in the 1880s, and French engineers, French scientists, designers were ahead of the game and continue to be. Now, whether the army took advantage of their skills, that's another story. In 1900, they started work on a self-loading infantry rifle designed to be affordable for mass production. And in 1901, there was the Int B5 prototype, which was a self-loading gun in a 6mm rimless round. This was important because it was the first direct impingement, as we know it today, gun. It also used a tipping bolt system. Although it didn't go anywhere, World War I happened. But in the depths of the war, 1916, this rifle was designed based on previous trials and efforts, and it was produced. In fact, they would build nearly 86,000 in 1917 and 1918, and it would see issuance in the field during the last year of World War I. It would also lead to the improved Model 1918, which is more of a carbine, at least in comparison, and they would build another 6,000 some odd of those, meaning that roughly 90,000 plus in this family were assembled between 1917 and 1919. Not bad. Well, sort of. On paper and during factory tests, these worked well. This is a long stroke gas piston with a rotating bolt. If this seems similar to the way it kind of wraps around to the side and comes forward to the Garand, that's because John Garand, in a lot of ways, was inspired by this system. His own admission. He also attributed the trigger group to what he came up with. I'm not going to charge it because a problem, these were built all towards the end of the war when France had limited resources. The metallurgy was iffy then, and today, yeah, I wouldn't fire one of these. Let's just put it like that. But the big problem was the charging system. You opened up the bottom and fed it with 5-round en-bloc style clips. They were similar, but not interchangeable with the Berthier's. This introduced a huge point for mud and grime to get in, and it just wasn't the best. These had a good reputation. Hey, lots more firepower, reasonably accurate for what they were, but they were fiddly to disassemble. They were sensitive to mud and dirt. Good first effort, and really showed that France had been working on this. I mean, it was better than anything else they'd come up with in 1917. But it was pretty limited. In the 1920s, much like in America, the budget in France for arms development was quite small. That wouldn't prevent companies like MAC and MAT, as well as MAS, from various prototypes, and you would see them returning to the Int B system with the tilting bolt and eventually the gas impingement. And that would result in the model of 1928 prototype, which would directly lead to the model of 1938 prototype, which was refined a bit and was scheduled to go into full production as the 1940, what we would call the MAS 40, right as the Germans came over. And it was very similar to this system here, so technically pre-war. Interestingly, the Germans were not interested in it, even when they had access to it. It was firing the new rimless 7.5mm cartridge and was designed to be durable and easy to work on in the field, and also to use some of the same components, namely the stock and bayonet, from the MAS 36 bolt action. Also a very similar sighting system. So the 1940 would only be built in small numbers, but as soon as France was liberated in 1944, work would resume in MAS, and we would get the MAS 44. Almost identical to the 40, except we now have the detaching, I like the external mag catch that's actually on the mags, not the gun. Kind of shows you they were added to the design, but it works. 10-round mag. Originally, the 1940 had an internal 5-round mag. In fact, it used the same floor plate as the bolt action as well, and you topped it off with the stripper clips. You can still top these up with stripper clips too. And these were ordered, I think they ordered roughly 20,000 by the French Navy, but only about 6,200 were delivered in 1945. Because they would move on to bigger and better things. The Army would go with the MAS 49, which is the same gun, except they took the bayonet off, they added a grenade launcher, and they added a universal scope rail type system to it. Same gun. They would build nearly 21,000 of those, but that would be led into the 4956, where they would build over 275,000. And again, the only real differences are just hardware and kind of barrel configurations. Stock receivers are the same. So even though very few of this was produced, it's part of a whole lineage going back to here and before with the Int B, and that's why France really has to be mentioned. Here the action is. Charge back. You can see the edge of the direct impingement tube. It does just directly lead gas from the barrel to the bolt carrier at the bolt down below. True direct impingement. These had a mix of a phosphate and a paint finish, adjustable rear sight, full length handguard on this style, and the 44, as I said, used the same spike bayonet stored below the barrel as the 36 hooded front sight. Yeah, interesting gun. And this style would actually stay in service longer than any of the other guns we're looking at today. So to say some really good things about this, it was relatively affordable to produce. It was very well made. This is a true machined receiver. All the parts here are big and chunky. Replaceable in the field. The firing pin looks like a giant nail. You're not going to readily break those. Very pronounced safety, very big trigger, magazines easy to detach and install, both hold open, easily adjustable rear sight. If I can get it moving here. I say that, see it does it to me. It's easy when you're doing it the right way. Easy to charge, reciprocating handle of course. And while it's not a light gun, having the direct impingement does actually save a good bit of weight out here. So a lot of your weight, even though it's 10 pounds, is actually center. That's not a bad thing. Not at all. Fun fact too, they use special screws in these that only an armorer's tool could use, so the soldiers wouldn't be monkeying with them. Some downsides. Accuracy reports are kind of hit or mixed on the 44 and 49. Some report they were very accurate, some report less than desirable. I will say the sights, while they're good battlefield sights, are not the most adjustable. Just elevation, windage, and the front sight, all that's set at the factory. The bore is actually countersunk from the factory, basically counterbored, so that the crown won't get damaged. That's pretty cool. But of course, you're still using a 10-round mag. The triggers on these are fine. Nothing to write home about. It's hard to say a lot of bad about these. They actually really nail it. Almost as if they've been working on it for 50 years when this came out. That's probably why these would stay in service for a long time. But of course, they were firing their own cartridge, which is a lot like 308. I should mention that too. A lot of these different variants in America you find are marked 308 or 762. Those were redone by Century and other importers, so buyer beware. In France, they were 7.5 with only like 250 officially converted for the French police, I believe it was. But yeah, just honestly a really cool gun and a lot of fun to shoot these guns. And yeah, but of course we'll revisit this at the end. Sorry if you think I cheated by sliding this in here, but I think it deserved it. I actually considered putting this one before even the M1 Garand. The Soviet-Russian SVT-40, commonly known as, nicknamed the Tokarev rifle, firing 7.62 by 54 rimmed. This is a short stroke gas piston system with a tilting tipping bolt, and it feeds from removable 10-round magazines. We have a barrel that is roughly 24.5 inches, including a muzzle brake. Overall length of 48.5 inches, so this is our longest so far. However, it's also our lightest at 8.5 pounds. That was actually part of the intent, was to be light and handy, if not necessarily short. This is an interesting gun with an interesting history reputation. Like France, Russia was interested in self-loading weapons in World War I, the famous Fedorov model of 1916. But it's hard to classify the Fedorov as a self-loading battle rifle, infantry rifle. For one thing, it was select fire. It could do full auto. For another, it fired a non-standard cartridge that actually used 6.5 Japanese Arisaka instead of 7.62 by 54R. Originally, they actually wanted to use a true intermediate cartridge in it, but the needs of the war, that was the best they could do. And in reality, very few were produced because Russia just did not have the resources. The idea was there, but it just really couldn't be implemented. I wish I had one to show you, but for one thing, they would be considered a machine gun. They're still active. And for another, they're just exceedingly rare in America. Oh well. A few are still produced under the Bolsheviks after the takeover, and this kind of whetted their appetites. And while in the early 1920s, military research was kept to a limited pace because of other social things, they would receive more funding in the mid and late 20s than other nations at the time. And the self-loading rifle concept would be bolstered because Joseph Stalin himself was a fan of it. So once he kind of grabbed the reins, it was clear something was going to happen. In the mid-20s, the primary designers looking into the project were Fedorov himself still, Tokarev, and Dityev. In 1926, a young upstart would come in with a proposed gun, Simonov, but it would actually be rejected. The Simonov gun actually used the gas trap, the bang system. The other guys, they tried all kinds of things. In fact, for a while, Tokarev tried converting Mosins to be self-loading, first using a recoil system, then a gas piston. There was a bunch of back and forth. Trials in 25, 26, and 28, and 30, all kind of unconclusive, or at least a winner was not officially declared. But around 1933, they got serious. And now it's between a Tokarev and a Simonov design. And in 1934, the Simonov kind of won out. It would officially be adopted as the ABS 36, and you guessed it, 1936. And much like the Fedorov before it, it was select fire, but it fired the 7.62 by 54R cartridge, so full power. Magazines up to 20 rounds, yada yada. Those are also exceedingly rare in America. Tokarev lost, and the ABS was put into service, and it was planned to be pretty widely issued. That was the initial thing. But as soon as the first guns were coming out of Tula in 1937, problems arose. So much so that production was temporarily halted in 1938 to try to work out the problems. And this would actually lead to another round of trials. The problem with the Simonov, it was very... Well, for one thing, the automatic fire was completely useless. For another thing, the bolt system was quite complicated and not the easiest to disassemble. Also, let's be honest, Tokarev was politically friendly with Stalin, at least at this time. And to be fair, when the AVS would go to war in the Winter War at the end of 1939, it didn't prove all that well suited to ice, snow, mud. It wasn't a fantastic design. So when at the end of 1938, a Tokarev design was adopted as the SVT-38, replacing the AVS-36, it wasn't a horrible decision. And the SVT-38 was just single shot, safe and semi, and it actually is very similar to the 40 version here. The receiver, the bolt system, but the only difference, this has a somewhat shorter receiver. The 38, it would go into production first at Tula in mid-39 and then Izhevsk later on that year, and they would start cranking them out. By the way, they didn't make many AVS-36s, and by not many in Russia, only about 65,000. The SVT-38, the first version, they wouldn't make many either, only about 120,000. Numbers are a little weird over there. Just as the AVS before it, when the SVT went to war, there were issues. Because it was made so light and handy, there were problems with stocks breaking. It was a two-piece stock design. The magazine being detachable, they were getting lost. Things of that nature, little things that needed tweaking. And so in 1940, this improved version was adopted. Now, Simonov tried to come back and win the crown again, saying he'd worked on his design and made it better, but Tokarev was basically given one more chance with this version here. It's a little bit shorter, with a somewhat more compacted muzzle brake. This is the early fishtail style. We went to this metal shroud and single-piece stock as opposed to the early two. We went from 2 barrel bands to just down to 1. The cleaning rod was changed. Like I said, the receiver was shortened. Internally, not much changed. The mag catch was actually made folding, so it was kind of a lock. When it's deployed, you can easily use it like any mag catch. In fact, it's quite large, but then you can actually fold it up to lock it. We do have a manual safety here that is at least more usable than on a Mosin. And of course, we have a reciprocating charging handle on the side for the action. Here it is open. Of course, it can be topped off with 5-round Mosin stripper clips, or the mag can be removed. Unlike certain other countries and times that had removable mag guns, Russia would actually issue up to 3 with a gun, at least when they could afford them. There was even a pretty cool little leather pouch that held 2 mags that soldiers would carry. So there was the idea that in combat you could quickly get fresh rounds by swapping mags, and then when things slowed down you could use stripper clips to top off. But yeah, production would get underway at Tula and Izhevsk. And the idea, they wanted to produce 2 million a year, meaning that a full 1/3 of the Red Army would be equipped with these, with the other guys still having Mosin bolt actions. That was in theory. The highest production point was 1941, when roughly 1940, when roughly 1 million were made in a year. That was the highest production time. So, what went wrong? In the end, when these were officially discontinued in January 1945, only 1.6 million had been made total. This is a hard one, and I'm trying to, in my mind, think of a way to kind of get to the point, because it's really worth its own video. There's a lot of positive things to say about this gun. For one, as already mentioned, it's relatively light for the day and time. A bit of a double-edged sword with this large of a cartridge, but this early muzzle brake is pretty effective. It's much easier to disassemble for cleaning and maintenance than previous guns. It even has an adjustable gas port, gas regulator, which means it can fire a wider range of ammunition and in different climates. Nice handle. Actually, the mags for it are quite well done. They're curved for the rimmed cartridge and made of good quality steel. Nice semi-pistol grip stock. They even made scopes quite common. Now, Your early guns all had rails, but not the notches. They would make over 50,000 scoped dedicated sniper versions, but of course you could still use the iron sights. And that's what most would be. But, on the other hand, this is long. And it was pretty sharp recoiling. And that would often put stress on the thinner areas of the stock, like the wrist here. Now, some later stocks would be reinforced, bulked up to help, but some parts like that were found to be fragile. And as good of a semi-auto as this is, it does require more cleaning and maintenance than a bolt action, especially using the corrosive ammo of the day and time. There's just more going on, and the Russian army at the time, yeah, you know how it goes. And of course, these were more expensive to produce. Now, if Russia had had time, maybe they could have acclimated, trained with, and produced enough of these to matter. But of course, June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, time was up. This is my oh shit Germans Mosin. 1942-43 Mosins could be quite colorful. I brought it out because so these were, the Tokarevs were being made at Izhevsk and Tula, but by 1942, Izhevsk was ordered to focus on producing Mosin 9130s. And Tula would scale back, and of course they moved around. It gets complicated, you know what I mean? Basically, what my point is, only one factory is building these by 1943, and in ever decreasing numbers, because some machine guns like the PPSH-41 are becoming more important, and Mosins. You know, this gave a better rate of fire, but this you could give to anyone and they'd know how to use it. Also, the Sniper 9130 was better than the Sniper SVT. And you could build roughly 3 of these for every one of these, even with the kind of mid-war cutbacks in production. It's kind of a shame because it is a good gun, but kind of the wrong place, wrong time. So even though it was officially discontinued at the beginning of 1945, effectively it had been canceled years earlier. And Russia would very quickly phase these out of its service and only give them to a handful of allies post-war. It just wasn't there. It wasn't hitting it. Even though I think it has some pretty good features for the day and time, especially surrounding the magazine and the gas system. And I wouldn't be the only one to think that. It's kind of funny. This gun wasn't too popular in Russia, but it was actually more popular outside of it. So, let's go to the first of a kind of a 2-part story here. The Nazi German Gewehr 41. Often this is called the G41W, but technically that's incorrect. I'll explain in a minute. We have a 21.5-inch barrel, but our overall length is roughly 45 inches. And this is the heaviest so far at 11 pounds. It fires the 7.92 by 57 round 8mm Mauser from a fixed 10-round box magazine. And yeah, this is a full-size gun. But they did actually build quite a few of these. No one knows for sure. 40 to 145,000 is often stated. I tend to, based on serial numbers, estimate around 100,000. But we'll get there. First, why is this one so weird? And why was it so unsuccessful? Well, a lot of it has to do with thanks to the Kar-98K, the Mauser. I picked my Russian capture one. I really like these Russian capture guns. I've said before in many videos. Okay, so the US, France, Russia all wanted to do a semi-automatic infantry rifle to issue en masse as much as possible. Varying levels of success, but that was the plan. Germany, however, even in the 1930s, was not very interested. The idea was, we're going to continue using bolt actions, but they will be supporting mobile machine guns like the MG34, MG42. I should also point out they had some pretty early success with the MP38 and MP40 machine guns as well. So they were just trying to skip the whole generation to some extent. Part of it was economics, part of it was the old guard thought that soldiers would waste shots. And of course they knew the war was coming because they were going to start it. So, production time and all that. And this was pretty much the prevailing attitude. There were some dissenters, of course, up through 1940. It only really started to change in 1941. They were starting to notice the American M1 Garand, but then Operation Barbarossa, they obviously came across the SVT. And Germans would pick up and reuse the SVT from Russians in large numbers. It was known as the Gewehr 258R, if it were the 38 variant, or Gewehr 259R, if it were the 40 variant. And the German army, at this time quite experienced, well-trained, and disciplined, just seemed to have better luck with the SVT compared with the Russians. Not really casting blame, it's just kind of one of those facts. So the end result was, in 1941, the German government sent out a request for a semi-automatic rifle to several companies, and the two respondents that got anywhere with it were Mauser and Walther. The thing is, the requirements were quite ludicrous, including things like you could not drill a hole in the barrel. Yeah, that was a notion in the 20s, but by the 1940s, almost everyone realized that was a fool's errand. Not the Germans. They also wanted it where if the semi-automatic system quit working, there would be a bolt action system that you could manually cycle the action. However, it needed to be the same manual of arms as a Mauser rifle. Seeing the problem there? And there were other crazy requirements besides, but that kind of gives you the idea. They also wanted a lot of commonality in parts and whatnot, accessories. Mauser, creating the G41M, pretty much obeyed the request to the letter of the law and released a very unsuccessful gun that would ultimately lose. They would build under 7,000, and only about 5,000 were even usable. The other 2,000-ish, 1,500, were basically sent back as junk. Their system was just way too complicated. It never would have worked. Walther did better with the G41W. Now, I said a minute ago, this is not technically that. That's because when it was officially adopted as the Gewehr 41, the W and all that was dropped, and it just became large G41, official issue adopted gun. The M's and the W's were just for trials. But in 42, it was selected, and of course it was put into production at Walther. It was also produced by BLM. No, not that BLM, a different BLM, who would actually make the majority of these because Walther would move on to other projects quite quickly. And nevertheless, 2 factories were turning these out by 1942, and that's why we have a relatively high production number. But we have very few in the world today because the bulk of them were sent to the Eastern Front at a time when it was just becoming an ever-increasing meat grinder, and so many were lost over there, or maybe you still are in stockpiles to this day. So comparing the bolt-action Mauser to the semi-auto 41, you notice they have the same style of butt plate. They use the same pass-through sling swivel, although there's no need for a donut on this. Forward, of course, we have a very similar barrel band system. We need a top full-length handguard. I'll explain in just a second. We have a very similar bayonet lug, similar front sight, similar cleaning rod. Pretty much all Mauser-esque parts, even a Mauser-style sight. We have a charging handle on the right, which didn't, strictly speaking, meet the letter of the requirement, but it worked better, so they let it go. And it does have a somewhat Mauser-inspired wing safety here, but it's a little different. Now, the operating system is where this is honestly mechanically fascinating and also quite horrible. The whole no hole in the barrel thing. This is a gas trap. This is a bang system. Designed in Denmark. Gas is collected in this cone, and then it's sent to a small cylinder that goes around the barrel. That kicks back, and then it hits a long, flat op rod or piston, and then that comes back and hits our bolt carrier. That's when we need a full-length upper handguard. Earlier ones were wood. Later they went to this phenolic style. A lot of reasons there. I would imagine the wood was actually swelling in some instances, or if it got dented, it would actually impact. It's a horrible system, I'm not going to lie. It's even so bad that, notice our front sight is actually mounted to the sleeve, meaning that accuracy was never great because this had to be removed regularly for cleaning. And by regularly, I mean like every 100 rounds, maybe even less, especially with corrosive ammo the day and time, because this would collect crud up here, blowing it all across your barrel, all because they didn't want a hole in the barrel. On top of that, we have a fixed 10-round mag. Okay, that wasn't so weird pre-war, but by the wartime, if you're going to do a fixed mag, make it at least internal like the Garand. This hangs down, but it requires 2 Mauser clips to top off. So, it's kind of the worst of both worlds, but it's what the German government requested. Them Nazis, they were smartses. Try to think of good things to say about it. Because these were made earlier in the war, machining was quite nice. In fact, sometimes too nice. The parts fit too tightly and didn't have enough room for mud and dirt. But they were relatively well machined. They also started using, like I said, a synthetic upper handguard, which is a pretty forward-thinking thing that would eventually result in what we think of as Bakelite, although this is more of a wood polymer mix. And it did give the German soldier a self-loading rifle. So rapid rate of fire, even if it clogged up very quickly. What was, frankly, arrogant of them, they had not focused on self-loading rifles when other countries had, but they still thought they knew better. Again, the hole in the barrel thing is the major oopsie here. But, of course, the war would disillusion them with that. That said, even though production would only go through about 1943, maybe into early 44, just using up parts, these would still stay in service through 1945. Again, they had tens of thousands, so they would use them. And while this gas system was problematic, it was still at least a workable system, at least compared to the Mauser. For example, this bolt and carrier system, it's actually a flapper bolt. It's very interesting. It's actually inspired by the DP light machine gun out of Russia, where the flaps go out and then when it comes back they're tracked into the bolt body, meaning the bolt doesn't actually have to tilt or turn or even rotate out of position. So in theory, there might be some accuracy benefits there because it's just locking with a dual wedge system. Of course, we have a main recoil spring, like I said, safety. There's a hold open latch here. The triggers on these feel quite interesting. But what cracks me up is just how much it does resemble the Mauser. You could tell that they were really just married to the Mauser system, and even at this point, they're not totally sold on a semi-auto, but they feel like they have to do it. So this is what they come up with. And it was officially adopted. Luckily for the Germans, it wasn't the end of the story. The Swedish AG42, nicknamed, sometimes called the Ljungman or Ljungman, but that's more of an American thing. And this rifle is like Sweden looking at Germany and kind of laughing. It's also interesting that while many major nations, Japan, Britain, Italy, did not have a semi-automatic rifle, Sweden did. And that's not to discount Sweden, but, you know, when there's only a half dozen or so in the war, You wouldn't think of Sweden. But, well, German aggression, guys. So, we have about a 24.5-inch barrel, pretty average, in an overall length of just shy of 48 inches. Weight-wise, we're just a little bit under 10.5 pounds. So this is not the lightest by any stretch, but still lighter than the G41. And we fire 6.5 millimeter, 6.5 by 55 Swedish. This was actually introduced to fire the new Spitzer, but it could also fire the older ball type. And it fed from a detaching 10-round mag, although because of the double lock system, it was really intended to be loaded from chargers, which, yes, loading this gun from chargers is kind of like taking your life into your own hands. Actually, it's not. There's a very safe way to do it, but you got to remember to do it. Otherwise, it's a scary procedure. We'll get into that. This uses the direct impingement gas system, again, combined with the tilting or tipping bolt. So, nothing really new there, but it does have a few unique features. But let's give a little context. As with so many other nations, Sweden was using bolt-action Mausers, although they were still using the small ring based on the 94-96 pattern, basically the same as the 95, just a little bit different for Sweden. Yeah, and they've been working with the 6.5 cartridge. I really like Swedish Mausers. They may be my favorite. Well, they had the long rifle and the cavalry carbine. But in the 1930s, a little behind the trend, but still, hey, they're there, they adopted the M38 short rifle, intermediate length barrel, and at first they would convert 96 rifles down to these, so they'd be Carl Gustaf, but then Husqvarna would make brand new production guns. But, well, German aggression. So as early as 1939, Sweden started thinking about maybe at least having some self-loading rifles. And like many other nations, again, they first thought, hey, can we convert our Mausers to load themselves? But they quickly gave up on that, and they had trials in 1940 running through 41. And this was the result. It was pretty clearly the winner. Developed primarily by Eric Eklund, these would be built at the Carl Gustav's factory. Now, the intention was never to re-equip the entire Swedish army with these. In fact, they would only build about 30,000 between 1942 and 1944. That was just to give the frontline troops a bit of an edge and to be a bit of a gentle warning to Germany, don't invade us. Kind of similar to what Switzerland did. And of course, they could have always built more if they needed to. So, the idea was frontliners would have these, and the rest would have bolt actions, including the M41 sniper rifle, which was a damn fine weapon. Very interesting. By the way, this is, of course, the 42B, and that was an update done in 1953 that added these bumps. It also changed the side adjustments a bit, added this bumper. Pretty much all of your 42s were turned into Bs, but it's neither here nor there. What can I say about this gun? Aside from it is really cool. In a lot of ways, Sweden had the same requirements as Germany, but they were more realistic about them. They wanted a full-length rifle, mirroring in as many ways as possible their bolt action, firing their standard cartridge. But they didn't have the ridiculous no holes in the barrel requirement. In fact, they had extra holes. They gave it an integrated muzzle brake, which is just cool. Took the same bayonet and cleaning rod as the 38. At least the B version does. Has a hooded and adjustable front sight. We have a 3/4 top handguard rear sight. And as I said, the magazine is removable, but it actually has a lock This was something, again, improved with the beam version, the early version, but it still had a lock so it wouldn't get lost in the snow, because you were expected to top these off with stripper clips. Now, one thing that does remind me of the German trials is they did not want external moving parts. A lot of it had to do with the cold, the environment, the ice. They wanted a gun that when you fired it, you just had the bolt moving and nothing else going around. Germany had that requirement as well. Well, this is, I believe, the only non-reciprocating charging system gun on our list tonight. They may have not liked moving parts, but I think someone missed the memo that it shouldn't also maim your soldiers or try to eat them. To anyone out there, if you ever do an AG42 video, you have to actually show this system. Also, if you have any friends, because it is very unique. Now, obviously when the mag's in, it'll hold open. What if you don't want to be et? Well, simple solution. Put your safety on, and you're fine. When the safety is on, it effectively locks the bolt and carrier together. But if you take it off, know it's happening. So, when someone is intelligent and well trained on these, they're quite safe. But if they're not, and considering it is a very unique system, be aware. Be aware. That's just fun. I've had this gun for 20 years, this exact gun, and it still amuses me. So what can I say about this? For one, the 6.5 cartridge, it's just a good cartridge, which already gives us good range and good accuracy. It also, especially considering the gun's weight and even integrated muzzle brake, these don't climb. They also have perfectly good triggers for a military gun. And while they do intend to be loaded with clips, they do have the attaching mags, so that's something, even if it's more a maintenance thing. And the quality of construction is tops. Very nice wood, very good metallurgy, quality gun, and they feel like it. And I will also say too, Sweden developed these very quickly at a very reasonable cost, didn't run the government out of, and they just got them done. It was a very efficient process. Now again, the systems inside are pretty standard. A lot of people attribute the tilting bolt system to the SVT-38. Maybe, but either they hit upon the direct impingement on their own or they copied earlier French designs. Again, France had been working with direct impingement since 1901 with the Int B5, so surely someone had heard of that or any of the later designs. And France, too, used tilting or tipping bolts, so I have to wonder if they weren't more inspired by French ideas. Oh well. The charging cocking system is definitely all Sweden's. And, well, I guess one good thing, if your enemy stole this gun and didn't know how to work it, maybe it's like a defense device. I don't know. You know, if I'm looking for downsides, yeah, the charging system is a little funky. The gun is, again, not light. And these were all produced in peacetime. Who knows how well they would have done at large scales in the hundreds of thousands or millions. It was definitely something designed for Sweden. But although we do know the Hakims came later, it's really hard to say a lot of negative about them, aside from just, yeah, the size and the weight. But again, for the Swedish environment, for their needs, it was very, very great. And again, their standard Mausers up here, that'd still be what they would mostly call upon for warfare. But what an odd little piece of history. I love it. Kind of a mid-roll break here to remind you, if you're enjoying this, hanging out, you might check out Patreon. If you can't donate over there, I understand. But if you could, at the very least, like, share, subscribe, comment. Comments are always fun. And with that, let's get back into it. Belgium, FN Herstal, SAFN, also known as FN49, or model of 1949. Nicknamed the rifle made by a man with an unpronounceable name. Even people that are very good at French speaking do not have Save. You know who I mean, though. Browning's student, partner, friend, and in some ways successor, at least spiritually. Spec-wise, this is very similar to the M1 Garand. About a 23.5-inch barrel. Overall length of about 43.5 inches. And weighs 9.5 pounds. Now, much like with the French, you might be saying, well, this is World War II, and yeah. But this video is more on just this generation, but to be fair, this is connected with World War II as well. Saif actually started work on this in the mid-30s, maybe as early as 1930. And his first patents were in 1936, with some early prototypes, test rifles, 1937, and really by 1938, FN had plans to put a 5-round version into production for the export market. It was only after the invasion of Poland in 1939 that these were temporarily put on hold so that FN could produce more bolt-action Mauser types. And then, of course, in 1940, the Germans came and everything got put on hold. Luckily, Saif was able to make his way eventually, with a lot of daring and do, to the UK, and he would help out at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. By 1943, he was back at work on his self-loading gun system, and actually produced a couple of tool room prototypes, and the government ordered a few as samples, and then placed an order for 2,000, but between the war coming to an end and some last-minute issues with gas system, this order was ultimately canceled. A lot of late World War II orders got canceled, so it's not really a reflection on him. But of course, he would go back to Belgium in 1944 anyway, and continue work on his rifle here. And by 1946, we see some more pictures, and as early as 1947, prototypes are being shown, and as early as 1948, this gun is available for purchase. Now, I haven't mentioned caliber. There's a good reason for that. There wasn't one. Those fellers at FN, pretty smart. They realized that post-World War II, any first world nations would either have guns left over from the war or could get guns from America, Uncle Sugar. Same goes for the communist world, the second world. They could either have them already or get them from Russia. But that left the unaligned nations, what at the time, or soon would be called the Third World. That wasn't a derogatory term. That was something nations like India proudly proclaim themselves, meaning they're not part of communist or capitalist. It's their own thing. That was the market FN went for. So naturally, most purchasers would end up in South America and kind of just out of the way places in Africa. Although we would have a few European nations. The way that Saif made this, it had an adjustable gas system, and it was very flexible on the caliber. Now, this has a short stroke gas piston under the handguard, and it has a pretty standard tilting, tipping bolt system here with reciprocating handle, and then your rear sight mounted on your top cover, and it feeds from a fixed 10-round mag being topped off again by chargers. Here it is open just to show you. 2 clips will do. And so these could be chambered for any full power cartridge the customer might desire. This one is an Egyptian contract, so it's in 8mm Mauser, which actually was the prototype that Saif was working on in 1943. That was the cartridge he kind of had selected. 303, the British round, being a rimmed round wasn't really ideal, and 30-06 from America wasn't as ubiquitous as it would soon become in the post-world. So, 8mm Mauser kind of made sense. But there are plenty of other versions. The first contract sent was actually in 7x57 Mauser to Venezuela. Famously, Argentina bought them in 7.65x53. Now, some might be saying those Argentine guns had detachable 20-round mags. Only the 7.62 NATO conversions done for the Argentinian Navy, and those were done within Argentina, so they didn't really count here. We would also see a few other kind of one-offs, like a 6.5 Swedish, like the Ljungman we looked at, that caliber. But many would end up being in 30-06, 7.62x63, including Belgium. They would actually end up adopting these themselves and using them in the Korean War. The Belgian Congo would also have some, and Luxembourg would do some 30-06s. And next to the 308s, the 30-06s are the most desired in America because of just the commonality, especially back in the 50s and 60s. FN met with reasonably good success because this is really the culmination of this style of gun. And they would end up building about 175,000. Not bad considering just how many small arms were in the world in the late 40s, early 50s. This gun really does combine all the lessons learned from the Garand or the Tokarev, work done in Germany. We have a Mauser-style semi-pistol grip stock, very bulbous here. And like I said, we have the tilting bolt system, something that would become quite ubiquitous. It's simple, dependable, accurate enough. The short stroke piston is kind of proving to be a very good thing, especially with the adjustable gas. This can even have a gas plug that would shut off the feed if you needed to launch grenades. And we even have a threaded barrel, although for most models it's just there. But for example, the Venezuelan guns had a muzzle brake. And we have quite a nice long sight radius with practical sights here. Perfectly good trigger safety, and it has a feature I always thought was cool. It has not a loaded indicator, but a cocked indicator. A pin sticks out of the bottom of the trigger guard, letting you know your hammer's back. It's a small thing, probably not necessary, but it's kind of cool. It also has a small moving dust cover on the other side where the charging handle is, for much the same purpose. There's just a lot of thought put into these, and they were very well made. They were actually known for very good accuracy, good dependability. Even if you were having cycling issues, hey, just open up your gas system a little bit. But FN knew this was a limited product. So why did they do it, aside from the fact that the designer had been working on it for a decade? Well, the reason I had to include this gun in this video, one of the major reasons the FN-49 is important to firearms history is, of course, the right arm of the free world, the FN FAL. You can't not. We have the same gas system for all intents and purposes. Short stroke. We have even the same look to the plug here. And here's our adjustment on the FAL. This is here too. It just happens to be under the handguard, where it's a little more protected. Even the sights look the same. This has the lower sights, but yeah, sight picture's the same. The bolt system, the lockup, very, very similar. Now, the FAL has the recoil spring in its stock, and this does not. However, the recoil system in here is very, very similar to what would be used on the FN Model 50, 60, well, 1 and 3 and 4. Basically, the paratrooper. So even the recoil system, return system, there's just so much in common. Even the mags, while they're different, there's a common lineage. And of course the FAL needs no introduction. Very important gun. Right up there with the Kalashnikov, the M16, the G3. Not the M14 though. But that's a story for another day. I just had to kind of mention it. In fact, one has to wonder if these FN-49s weren't sold by Fabrique Nationale, in part to fund research and development into the big brother, the offspring, the FAL. I don't know. Just thought it was worth pointing out. But it does kind of show that division between semi-automatic battle rifle and the select fire battle rifle. This isn't really an assault rifle as such. It's more of a battle rifle. And speaking of, this is my West German Gewehr 1 G1 build. Original. Of course, these are first made in Belgium, sent to Germany. Many went to Turkey. It's on a DSA receiver. And with that, speaking of Germany, let's return there and return to World War II. Nazi German Gewehr 43. G43, later Karabiner or Car 43, or just K43. Or sometimes even both G43 and K43 on the receiver. This has a 21.5-inch barrel, overall length of about 44.5 inches, and weighs about 9 3/4 pounds. So, a little shorter, a little lighter than the 41. Like the 41 though, it fires 8mm Mauser, and while it still feeds from a 10-round magazine, it is now detachable. And while it does use the same flapper locking bolt system, the big jump from 41 to 43, well, it's the gas system. You know, one reason I gave the 41 its own little section is because every time this comes out for video, it's always just to talk about this gun. And that's fine, it's where it is, but I just wanted to give it a little bit of its own spotlight. The bang system wasn't working out. I think the engineers at Mauser and Walther both knew it, but since that's what the government, the army ordered, they went with it, but they knew they would quickly realize. Plus, as I said, many soldiers got their hands on SVTs from Russia and saw that the gas piston system with its infamous hole didn't have any negative consequences. So already by 1942, Walther was working on the next gun, and by January 43, the first kind of trials samples were sent to the military and were put into the field and did well. So officially by that summer 43, production of the 41 was ordered halted, and 43 was ordered to switch over. Now BLM would keep making the 41s to kind of cover the gap because Walther would have to retool and re-equip to make the 43. And like I said, the bolt systems, it's very similar. But we have a new detaching mag instead of the fixed 10. The stock is similar, but we've gone away from that Mauser style plate, to a different style with the trapdoor for a cleaning kit. Interestingly, this one doesn't have one. Our big difference is, though, the barrel. Even though the length is essentially the same, we lose the gas trap, and we go to a gas piston short stroke, which is basically directly stolen from the Tokarev. And accessing the piston is super easy. You just push this band forward, then remove the handguard, and that's it. Now, this was not an adjustable gas system like the Tokarev. To kind of overcome any issues with low quality ammo, because this is getting towards the end of the war, or just fouling, they simply overgassed it. These weren't built to last. By 1943, they knew which direction the wind was blowing. They didn't build these guns to be around 30 years later. They were just hoping they'd fight for 6-7 months. So that was the solution, just dump enough gas into the system, which of course later would lead to cracking receivers. I am sure the designers at Walther knew that was a very distinct possibility. They simply didn't care because it didn't matter. Anywho, so by October of 1943, Walther was producing the first of the new model, and in every way it was an improvement. I can't really think of any way the 41 was better. I mean, I guess unless you're just a fan of a bayonet lug. But it was somewhat lighter, especially towards the muzzle, which is really where it counts on a firearm. And we have a much more reliable gas system, easier to clean. We have detaching mags. They also start issuing more than one mag per gun like the Russians did. And again, there's even storage for cleaning kit or spare parts. That's not to say the gun didn't have issues. Overgassing, as I mentioned, there were some firing pin issues. Extractors, the safety is still it's only retained with like a little spring clip. It's not on there real tight. And taking these apart is still On the other hand, scope rail, kind of neat. Whereas on the 41, it was only an option. For the 43, it was supposed to be a standard feature, even if an optic wasn't issued. Now, in reality, not all built had it, but the vast majority did. So there's a handful of them made by 43. Really, none of them get into the field until 44, and they weren't really encountered en masse until around D-Day in the summer of 1944. And production was up and running at Walther, BLM switched over, and Gustav started going. Gustav, which was a concentration camp. Actually, Walther had two factories in and of themselves, one of them being a concentration camp. But Gustav would only go for a little while because it was bombed and put out of production by August of 44. And these guns, thanks to sabotage by the brave people at the concentration camp, were not of great quality. BLM was known to have built the best ones. So they and Walther would continue to the end of the war. And even though they were really only in production a year and a half, slightly longer, they cranked out over 402,000. I should point out, these were originally marked G43 for Gewehr 43, but in 1944, the decision was taken to rename them Car for Carabiner 43, K43. This was only a name change on paper. In fact, for quite a few months, guns continued to be marked G. It wasn't until late 44 that K is consistent. But then you get to 1945 and you start to see G again sometimes, or even G and K both on the guns. It's a thing. It doesn't really matter. And there are plenty of updates. A few new technologies were introduced with this gun. For one, cold hammer forged barrels were introduced by BLM. For another, press and pinning the barrel instead of screwing it in, threading it in, was started with the G43, important for later. Also, these had forged, not finely milled receivers, at least some of them. The ones that were built on French receivers were actually still very finely milled. But, yeah. And the fact is, some advocated for switching all production from the K98 to the G43 because in some ways these were faster to produce. They required less precision. And some claim they required fewer parts, fewer man hours, and were overall cheaper to produce than a K98. Others would disagree with this, but the idea was this could be the new infantry rifle. That's even why the original versions have threaded barrels, so you can attach devices including grenade launchers, what have you. So why did the G43 not really take off? Well, for one, it was such a latecomer to the semi-auto game that while it was better than the 41, it was still kind of behind the M1 Garand, even the SVT. It had issues, and it was still German over-engineered. And we're still firing 8mm, which is what this video is about, guns firing the full power cartridge. But by 1944-45, this is increasingly less attractive. Because you know what comes, well, not even next, at the same time, a parallel project in Germany. What put pay to all of these, not just the Gewehr 43, was of course the Sturmgewehr, the STG 44. Although it went through many name changes, and actually was being developed at the same time. But whereas this was an outgrowth of rifles, like the Mauser and all that, this was an outgrowth of submachine guns. And whereas the 41 and 43 were meant to fire the standard 8mm, this was the concept for the intermediate cartridge, which was the future. That's a whole video topic in and of itself, but of course this fired 8 by 33 Kurtz. Now, of course, we talked at the very beginning about the M1 carbine and how its 7.62 by 33 cartridge really doesn't quite qualify. This is right on the other side of that line where it does, with 7.62 by 39 becoming the definitive early intermediate rifle cartridge. That's what makes this gun. Also aspects that make it being select fire, feeding from the detachable 30-round mag, and something that's not always appreciated, the fact that these were built to be mass-produced cheaply, stamped, forged, even some cast parts. These weren't meant to be sexy. They were designed and constructed like a submachine gun, cheap and efficient. Of course, it started off as the MKB-42, again with Walther. It would be the MKB-42W and MKB-42H for Hanel. They were the main competitors in 1942 for this whole program. This time, Hanel would be kind of selected by soldiers, although that would be an open bolt gun. They would switch it over to a closed bolt and actually adopt the trigger group from the MKB-42W, which is actually why the trigger group here isn't dissimilar in some ways to up here. Of course, Schmeisser is part of this too. It's a whole thing. That would become the MP-43. There's the whole thing with Hitler, which, to be fair, is a little misunderstood. His reasons were a little different, back and forth. Then it would become the MP-44, and then the STG-44 we know and love. And it would set the trend. What's funny is, it actually appeared slightly before the 43. In the summer of 1943, there started to be a few in the field. And by 1944, there were a number of these made. And they were being cranked out by Steyr, of course. They were made by Hanel. They were made at the Erfurt Arsenal. And a couple of others had their hand in the game as well. And they managed to crank out about 426,000 in roughly the same time as these rifles. So a few more. And they made mags for them. And they had to make their own cartridge. Overall length, of course, is quite a bit shorter. 16-inch barrel means that we have a 37-inch overall length versus 44, 45. What's funny is, though, the 43 is actually lighter. This is a heavy gun at over 10 pounds. Like I said, this is about 9 3/4 pounds. It's just funny. But this would be the future. So even within Germany, yeah. And both had their purposes. This was designed to work 400 meters or less range, have a rate of fire. This was designed for longer ranges to be scoped. So in theory, they could actually work together. But in practice, one of them was kind of a more traditional way of thinking, and one of them was quite forward-thinking. Also, the MP-44 here proved to have more endurance. These guns lasted a lot longer. So, worth pointing out. Even at the end, it just feels like Germany really didn't have its heart in the full-powered self-loading rifle. And earlier I said that the SVT was maybe a good gun, but the wrong gun for Russia at the time. Well, the MP-44 STG-44 was the right gun for Germany. Now, could it have changed the war if they had more? No, rarely are wars determined on the ground by small arms. But it did make retaking land in Russia and then taking over the Western Front slower. I mean, it meant that one person could hold up an entire squad or platoon, especially as long as ammo held out. What a future. But for another video. But that's why this generation was kind of a one and done. The first and the last self-loading generations are basically one and the same. And it's because of this gun, and also guns like the FAL we looked at, also German, that kind of show exactly why. So, we've gone through these. Time for me to rank them. And now we come to everyone's favorite part, ranking. We have 7 guns. Which is the least effective? I mean, come on. Germany, what were you doing? Although, you have to give America credit too there. They tried the gas trap more than most. But in the end, yeah. The Walther G43 K43. I think most people would rather just have a bolt action. With the readily failing, there we go, of the operating system because of the bang, the added length and weight, the added complexity in manufacture, the fact that we only have a 10-round mag which is fixed and has to be topped off by clips anyway, and the fact that accuracy is decreased in part because of the way the front sight is mounted. Yeah, for the most part, you're better off with a bolt action in most situations. Plus, this is technically the heaviest gun out of all of them here. So, yeah, easily Germany, who, to be fair, was one of the last to really get into this game, produced the worst. Hey, it's still better than the G41M, though. And, again, they did make roughly 100,000, so it has a place in history, and as far as collectability, it's kind of one of my favorites. You know, I'm a Walther collector, even though this is made by BLM. Again, not that BLM, the German one. And I like that it has the phenolic upper handguard. So I'm very happy to get this. So from a collecting standpoint, it's cool. You got to give it credit there. But I'm not shooting it anytime soon. If a part broke, I'd be up the creek. You just don't run across these anymore. So, yeah. Number 7. G43. Number 6. Thinking about it, if we're going to keep on with the theme, it's got to be the G43, or K43. It's a definite improvement over the 41. It's lighter, better handling, much better gas system, easier to maintain. Detaching mags, actually quite good mags, and quite economical, maybe even more so than the Mauser. However, the fact that it was designed mid-war and manufactured late-war shows. Again, it was intentionally overgassed, and they were still refining the design. It wasn't all that reliable compared to its contemporaries in 1943, 44, and it would obviously just beat itself up. Plus, with the 8mm cartridge, it had a lot of recoil, and oftentimes it wasn't really accurate enough to warrant a scope. Not all the time, but yeah. And it just took so much time, and they had so many better projects going on in Germany. The MP43, of course, submachine guns. It was just still too little, too late, and it suffered from German over-engineering. And let's not forget that a good chunk of these were made in concentration camps with forced labor. Walther II and Gustav. So, hey, that's not cool. Even the receivers made in occupied France under duress. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoy collecting K43s. Mostly because of the Walther connection more than the German Nazi connection. But just because I enjoy collecting them. I'm not a shooter of them. I don't want to do the kits, because if you want to shoot one today, you absolutely have to do some things, including putting an adjustable gas system in, because you don't want to crack these receivers or beat up any internals. These were always expensive, even when I was getting into guns, but at least you could afford them then. Today, prices are, I'll just put it like this, I'm not buying new ones. So, yeah, Germany just never got it right with the full-powered semi-auto rifle. But then they kind of make up for it by nailing the assault rifle, the storm rifle, almost right out of the gate. I just think they should have put all the resources that went into these, and the 41 for that matter, into the MKB 42, MP 43, 44. But of course, Nazis, not always the smartest fellers, and hindsight's 20/20 for all of us. Either way, number 6. So as we get into number 5, let me just say the remaining guns are all quite nice, and none of them are bad, but that's the nature of ranking things. You have to pick. And upon consideration, and there are lots of factors that go into it, some of it's just personal enjoyment, some of it's the fun of collectability, some of it's the ammo they shoot, some of it's just its place in time. You know, a gun that would have been revolutionary in 1936 obviously would be outdated in 1956. And, you know, there you go. So, a lot of these introduced innovations, but one of them is just too overshadowed. I've got to give it to the FN-49 at number 5. And that's not to say I don't really like these guns. But the FAL would come out just a few short years later. And also, FN with a fixed 10-round mag. I understand having that as an option, but what are you doing? At least make it a detachable 10-round mag, or at least make a factory option for a detaching mag. Worked well for Argentina. This is a really good gun. They were known for very good accuracy, extremely good reliability, the adjustable gas system I like, all the caliber options, good balance, extremely well made. But it's a stripper clip fed semi-auto. It's not especially light or small. It's not really outstanding in any way. It's a very traditional gun in an era when they knew they were doing better, and I'll give FN credit. They knew the FAL was coming. This was a stopgap gun. But that still kind of works against it. And also, I'll say on the collecting front, it's hard to find a nice one. And when you do, sometimes the price is insane. The Egyptians are such a grab bag, mixed bag. The Argentines, which are really cool, are hard to find, at least, you know, the 7.62 ones. And the Luxembourgian ones and the Belgian, well, we don't really have Belgian ones for one thing in America. Then the Luxembourg ones are just so spendy. And those are in 30-06, of course. The Venezuelans used to be kind of gettable, but now they've gone up too. Again, I hate putting it here so low, but I've got to be honest, and they would have been too. When this was released, it was more of a quaint thing. On the other hand, it is kind of the ultimate in this generation. It's the really final major entry, kind of like the Madsen bolt action for that. And you can tell they really learned a lot. It's just the magazine. That's the one area I'm just like, I don't understand. The gas system, the bolt system, the sights, they nailed it, but the mag was just a little peculiar. Plus, from a historical standpoint, while Belgium did use these in the Korean War, and a few nations did buy them, again, Egypt, Argentina, Venezuela, it's a bit more of a footnote than the rest in history. Even the German G43 is a little more iconic. This is one of those advanced collector guns, advanced knowledge guns. Otherwise, People just usually jump from the FN made Mausers to the FN FAL. But that's not a condemnation of it. But hey, someone's got to be number 5. Number 4. Wouldn't it be fun to put the M1 Garand here just to really get people going? I like trolling people, but maybe not that much, and I've got to be intellectually honest. And I would say at this point, it's pretty clear. The Soviet SVT-40. The only reason it hasn't been knocked out yet, I really like this gun. This gun personally has a lot of sentimentality to me. It's also fun to collect, and for a long time, well, not a long time, but for years, these are very inexpensive. $200 shipped from Century. That's what I paid for this one. But those days are over. But even now, even though these are quite a bit more money, they're on the cheaper side. And they fire affordable ammo, 7.62 54R. And I saw what Russia was going for here. While it's long, they know they're shooting a powerful cartridge, so you get a muzzle brake. We also have the detachable 10-round mag, but we have a way to lock the mag in. The FN-49, this is the kind of thing, if they wanted a fixed mag, they should have done. Having a scope rail, at least, early on as a standard thing, is cool. The gas piston system, especially being adjustable, is really a good idea. The tipping bolt, while not the most accurate, it's okay. And I appreciate what they were going for, trying to make this lightweight. Unfortunately, it was a little too much lightweight. These were known for beating themselves up, especially if the gas port was wide open. The stocks would split. And when they would heat up, they were known for vertical stringing, which is why the sniper versions never really got effective. And don't even get me started on the AVT version, select fire. Yeah, that was a misstep in and of itself. It was a really good gun, and I think if it had been developed somewhere else, it might have had a better fate, or even if it had had more time to mature in Russia, but it didn't. It was not the right gun for 1941. The Russian military wasn't ready for it. Russian industry wasn't even quite ready for it. It's funny to say that producing 1.6 million was a failure, but there you go. More than all the other guns we've knocked out so far combined. But when they plan to have 2 million a year made and re-equipping a third of the Red Army as quick as possible, it just did not live up. Germans came, the Mosin, and of course again the sniper version just didn't live up to things. And it had basically no success post-war, and it wasn't continued on. Rather, the SKS didn't continue either, or the AK. I mean, so it just, the things went a different route. This wasn't the future. But, again, good gas system, good bolt system, and even the mid-war examples, 42, 43, are surprisingly well made. And they did improve the stock somewhat. But, yeah, it was a disappointment to the Russians. The Germans really liked it, but today, yeah. But they are really fun to collect. But, to be fair, that being midpoint in all this, it seems very honest for this, if not even giving it a little bit of a benefit of the doubt. And if you don't have one, they are a lot of fun to shoot. I truly enjoy them. But if you do, shoot 148 ball out of it. Don't try to do like the 184, 200 green stuff. This gun's already hard enough on itself. Don't put it through more. And be sure to clean it if you use corrosive, because you will rust them out. I had one once that came to me. I got cheap because the case was completely rust welded into the chamber, and was a hell of a time to get out. So, yeah. I feel pretty comfortable with this one being at number 4. Its place in history is kind of forgotten. It's a bit like the FN-49. It's more of the invents collector thing. But it's pretty iconic for 1941 Russia, the German invasion, video games. So, neat gun. Just wasn't right for the time. Would have been great if it came 10 years earlier, though. And then there were 3. Now we'll knock out the M1 Garand. Okay. Number 3. As much as I really enjoy it, the AG42. The Ljungman, as it's colloquially known. But again, this is not a recrimination. They made a better self-loading rifle than Germany, than Russia. That's pretty good. And they did it quite quickly and competently. Yeah, it's a little heavy. It's a little thick, a little bulky. But it's the winter. I mean, up there a lot. It's Sweden. So, yeah, you don't want a little svelte gun. It's solid. And one big benefit to it, the cartridge. 6.5 Swede. Well, it is a full power round. Given the rounds that were in service at the time, it was much better suited for use in a self-loader than, say, the 8mm Mauser, 7.62x54, or even 30-06 and what have you. It was getting closer to that small diameter, if not smaller, intermediate cartridge. Manufacturing quality is very high. We do have a detaching mag, although more in theory than practice. We do have a readily usable safety, which is really good, considering the system. We have good sights, but since they're mounted before the action, the radius isn't as long as it could be. But, hey, I'm just impressed that Sweden made such a unique design, and they used, tried and tested methods, direct impingement, tipping bolt, hey. But they only made 30,000 of these in Sweden, so you've got to kind of be realistic about its influence. And they never really saw heavy combat of any type because of Sweden's position, so we don't know maybe how they would have done in the rigors. But since they did stay in the Swedish military for a couple of decades, I think we would have noticed if anything major was wrong with them. The B update did fix a few things, but it's more quality of life. And hey, it's a non-reciprocating cocking system, something that modern shooters insist on. So here you go, way back in 1942. To be fair, this system will separate the men from the boys and is kind of a litmus test for how careful and intelligent you are. So, yeah. Now, I understand why they went with it for their purposes. It was an innovative solution to addressing an issue that they had. And these, because of the cartridge and the gun, are quite accurate for being a semi-auto. And we have to give credit for them going on to create the Hakim and Rashid. But that was Egypt. So, this is another interesting but advanced collecting footnote in history. And to some extent, it kind of went nowhere, or at least very, short term. So, and who knows how much it would have cost them. Yeah, they could make 30,000. What would it have cost to make 300,000 or 3 million? I don't know how this would have scaled up. Maybe fine, maybe not. I don't know. So, it is here it is. I feel quite comfortable putting it at number 3. Now, part of it is just the uniqueness of it and how much I do like the gun. I like the design in general, and I like this gun in particular because I've had it a very long time, and I found it in a local gun shop just hanging on the wall. Funny thing is, back then it had been hanging there so long, they were thrilled someone was going to take it off their hands. So, I am partially inclined to it, so this, puts it up. And they're not cheap today, but they're not uber expensive either. They're not G43 prices. So, for a collector who likes Sweden, Finland, that area, get one. They're a lot of fun. The prices are very stable on these, $1,200, $1,300-ish. So one of the better values. And while 6.5 Swede isn't common, it's a gettable cartridge. At least if you don't plan on running thousands of rounds through it. Number 3, the Ljungman as we know it. And then there were 2. And now it's time to knock out the M1 Garand. Number 2. And Absolutely not joking this time. Which means my number one pick, in kind of representing the whole family, if I'm being honest. This is, like I said, the MAS 44, but it's essentially the same as the MAS 40, 49, 49, 56, so on and so forth. And I'm not just picking it because of the rifle. I'm picking it because of the caliber of the cartridge, too. And that's the problem with the Garand. While it is very good and extremely iconic, it was so nearly great. Let me explain. If the M1 Garand had been adopted firing the .276 Pedersen cartridge, or even some other smaller, lighter cartridge, that would have benefited it a great deal. Not saying make or break, but that would have been a good leap forward. I understand the logistics of why they stuck with 30-06. I truly do. But sometimes you've got to cut and go for something new. And that's actually what France did with the 7.5 cartridge. While it's not an intermediate cartridge, in a lot of ways it's similar to the 6.5 Swede. It, for a full power cartridge, was relatively light recoiling, and it was designed specifically to feed in automatic rifles, machine guns, and self-loading rifles. So it was created for this and other guns, and to be a family. And it was lighter than some, not as light as later, but, hey, some progress. France had a problem with sticking with 8x50 rimmed Lebel, and it did hold them back. In fact, it was the major limiting factor with the RSC. Well, that and the on-block clips and everything else. Let's also not forget that the RSC from France inspired John Garand per his own admission. If you look, the op rod is quite evident, but also internally the trigger group and whatnot. Now, the bolt system's a little different, but I digress. Another thing, I understand why the BAR mag conversions maybe weren't the best, but going to this fixed magazine, the on-block system, it did not future-proof things well. If you wanted a flush, why not just do a detaching mag that maybe comes down as far as the trigger guard? Or, I don't know, it's just the system is peculiar. Yeah, Grand Thumb it's not a myth, but it's maybe overblown. Still, a detaching mag and a smaller / lighter cartridge would have made what was already a really good leap forward a true great leap forward. Also, doing something about this bent asymmetric op rod, that was another one of the failure points in the gun. So you know what I'm saying. If the M1 Garand had actually been the M14. And really, America could have had something very close to this 20 years earlier if they had gone with the detaching mag and a new cartridge. Maybe not something like 30 light rifle, 308, 716 but you get the idea. And I actually decided to put the 10 round little mag in just to show you. Here we are, 2 more rounds than this, and it's not really hanging down. You can still go prone. Heck, you can even still top these off with stripper clips. And they did some things to try to address the op rod issue. On the other hand, by the time the M14 was adopted, the only thing wrong with it wasn't an M16. Yeah. Kind of funny how you think about it. But at any rate, been a little critical towards the Garand. Let's be critical towards our French friend. Probably the biggest drawback to the original MAS 40, if it had been adopted and put into full production as was the internal 5-round magazine. But as we see with the 44, they very quickly were able to integrate a detaching 10-round mag. Theoretically, you could go even more. From there, we can kind of see what they thought was good and bad about it when we look at the 49 here. Like I said, the 44 was used by the French Navy. This was used by the Army. And it's very similar. They did away with the underbarrel spike bayonet. They went to a 48 millimeter grenade launcher system. Showing you that, grenades are important to a lot of militaries. And everything else is near the same, except the receiver is now dovetailed for a scope mount as a standard feature. Doesn't mean every gun had a scope issued for it, but they were pioneering the idea. Now, yes, you can mount an optic to an M1 Garand, the D's, the C's, but it's a lot more involved, and it's just made that much more cumbersome by the en-bloc system. Whereas you compare that to the MAS, you can either top it off with clips or simply detach the mag. Okay, the kind of clothespin style latch is unconventional, but it also means you don't have to worry about your mag catch breaking. And so this was the version that the Army would use, and these would stick around for a minute. And then, of course, in the mid-50s, the ultimate variant would come into service and be produced in large numbers. The 4956, adopted at a time when the M1 Garand was on its very last production run in America. They were just getting started here. They would shorten the forearm. They would go to a blade bayonet, a little more universal. They would add a muzzle brake. They would go to a NATO standard grenade launcher. Barrel's just a little shorter. It's a lot lighter. Still has the same 10-round mag, scope mount. Further refinements to the rear sight. Heck, I even like the synthetic cocking handle on these. It's large, easy to grasp, easy to control. And keep in mind that France would build these despite being given many M1 Garands and carbines by Uncle Sugar. And these would stay in service officially until 1979, when the FAMAS would finally replace them. And they can trace their roots all the way back to those 1930s prototypes. And they saw combat in some really harsh environments, including Vietnam and sub-Saharan Africa. I think that's a pretty good endorsement of this thing. Well, obviously I'm having a little fun here, but I really do believe France had a winner. It was a really good service rifle. Perhaps the M1 Garand is overall more accurate, maybe, but this was really good just to give the troops. It was effective, and if you haven't ever handled any of the MAS models, they're just so chunky. This is a milled receiver. As I said earlier, the firing pin is so blocky. The gas system is just a tube. There's just so little to go wrong, and they're just built like a brick shithouse. The M1 Garand, it's a nicely built gun, but it does have more moving parts, like uprights I've already mentioned, and more than a few times in the past you've seen the whole receiver kind of crack here. This is a stress point, the rear of the receiver. Now granted, that's usually high round count, unless it was a defective receiver. But yeah, plus disassembly of the Garand's a little strange. Moving the trigger, pulling it out of the wood stock. With the French, you just press a button, take off your top cover, pull the guts out, and it has the benefit of using the same type of furniture and whatnot as the bolt action of the day. Whereas, of course, the Garand really doesn't share anything in common. Economically, I don't know which one costs more to make or time, but these are shockingly well-built guns. I don't know what to say about it. They really, really are. So overall, I think it has what you need. It has that rugged simplicity, rugged durability, user comfort. It is a relatively comfy gun to use, especially with gloves and such on. The Garand, again, it's a classic, but it's got a little bit of oddity to it if you think about it. I think we're kind of conditioned in America to think the Garand's the best and that's it. But there's some member berries and nostalgia goggles going on there. What I will give it credit for over the French, it definitely has more finely adjustable sights. Although keep in mind, much like with the German gun, your front sight's actually mounted on this bracket on the sleeve. Now, thanks to good tolerances, it still holds 0, but that's a potential area too. And of course, this gave birth to the M14, so sins of the son visited upon the father. Size and weight, they're so equal it doesn't even matter. No, yeah, I really do think this is an overlooked gun. It's a bit of a hipster answer. I picked up my original, that 4956 you just looked at, years ago. I've been shooting it and just simply enjoying it. And then there was one, my pick. Overall, it just feels the most refined of this series, which really it should, because France had been working on it the longest. So go to the comments and tell me why I'm wrong, if you haven't already. But then I have a challenge for you. Go find yourself an MAS 49 or 4956 and shoot it. Now this is 7.5 French. The 308, they're hack jobs done by Century. So that's not representative. You have to have one that's in the original chambering. Shoot that, and then come back. We might not agree, but I think you're at least where I'm coming from. These are a blast to shoot. And that's always a factor for me too. How much fun I have with a gun. That influences a lot. And I do like the 44 because it really shows the French spirit in World War II, at least the resistance. They were just getting out of being occupied, and immediately they start producing small arms of their own again. And it also shows kind of German short-sightedness because they had access to this gun. And they did nothing with it. Instead, they futzed around with the 41 and the 43. At least they took advantage of having access to the SVT. But just a fun video. I haven't done one of these long Mishaco Trek videos in quite a long while. So, since milsurp was on the brain, that's what we're doing today. Give you something to chew on for a minute, huh? There's a couple I don't have to show you, like 1941 Johnson. I've actually owned one of those before, but when they became way too valuable, it went away. Similarly, yes, Japan did copy the M1 Garand as the Type 5, but chambered for their 7.7. Those are exceedingly rare. Not quite as valuable as a gas trap M1 Garand, but pretty close. So I'll never have one of those. Same goes for things like the Fedorov, or even an AVS 36. Maybe one day I'll get an SVT 38, but I haven't had a chance to pick one of those up yet. So with that kind of out of the way, I think I've done a pretty good job of representing this generation of guns that really only was being developed in production and being introduced for about a decade, give or take. So Let me know your favorite. Let me know your own personal stories. How would you rank them? And as I've reminded you throughout the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you feel like it, go over and check out the Patreon page. We just did a recent Q&A. We'll do another one in a couple of months. And do video requests and do some behind-the-scenes footage and whatever else I feel like. This is Nisha. Also on behalf of Fox and Jero. We'll catch you very soon next time.